1:47 p.m. On August 23, 1944, Private First Class Viktor Dragomir crouched in a bombed-out cellar 30 meters from the German line in northern France. The 22-year-old Serbian immigrant had no ammunition, no grenades, no hope. 18 Wehrmacht soldiers were advancing through the rubble toward his position, and in his hands he held something that hadn't killed anyone in 2,000 years. A javelin he'd carved from a collapsed roof beam. In the next 4 minutes, that ancient weapon would account for more confirmed kills than any bayonet charge in the European theater, and the German 300th Infantry Division would evacuate an entire sector rather than face what their reports called the Spear Demon. This is what happened. Viktor Dragomir grew up in the steel mill district of Gary, Indiana, where Serbian immigrants worked 16-hour shifts pouring molten iron for $1.20 a day. His father died in a furnace accident when Viktor was 12. His mother took in laundry. Viktor dropped out of school at 14 to work the docks, hauling crates that weighed more than he did, building the kind of functional strength that came from necessity rather than training. But Viktor had one escape from the mills and the docks and the endless gray of industrial Gary. Every Sunday, his grandfather taught him bacanje koplja, the traditional Balkan javelin throw that Serbian shepherds had used for centuries to kill wolves threatening their flocks. In the vacant lots behind the rail yards, the old man showed Viktor how to balance a 7-foot ash pole, how to generate power from the legs and core, how to release at the exact moment when velocity peaked. In the old country, his grandfather said, a man who could throw straight never went hungry. Wolves, boars, sometimes worse than animals. By the time Viktor turned 18, he could put a sharpened pole through a fence post at 60 yards. Not that it mattered. He was drafted 3 months after Pearl Harbor and assigned to the 29th Infantry Division as a rifleman. Nobody asked if he could throw a spear. They handed him an M1 Garand and sent him to Fort Belvoir. He landed at Omaha Beach on June 7, 1944, one day after the initial assault. The 29th pushed inland through the hedgerows, where every field was a kill zone and every stone wall hid a machine gun nest. Viktor learned what the veterans already knew. In bacanje country, you died in the open, or you died clearing buildings, or you died in your hole when the mortars found you. The survival rate for infantry riflemen in Normandy was measured in days, not weeks. Private Eugene Hartley from Scranton died on June 14th. Took a sniper round through the throat while crossing a farm road. Viktor had shared cigarettes with Hartley the night before. The kid was 19, talked about going to college on the GI Bill, wanted to be a teacher. Viktor helped carry what was left of him back to the collection point. Corporal James Brennan from Southie died on June 22nd, stepped on a mine that had been buried under 2 inches of mud. Viktor was 6 feet behind him. Spent 20 minutes picking shrapnel out of his own left arm while Brennan's blood soaked into the French dirt. Private First Class Dennis Flynn from the Bronx died on July 8th. Wehrmacht patrol caught his squad in the open during a reconnaissance. Flynn took 3 rounds in the chest. Viktor held him while he drowned in his own blood, tried to tell him it wasn't that bad, watched the light go out of his eyes. Flynn was 23, had a wife and a baby daughter he'd never met. By August, Viktor had stopped learning names. The 29th was getting replacements every week, kids who barely knew which end of the rifle to point downrange. They'd arrive on Monday and die on Thursday, and you couldn't afford to care because caring meant you stopped functioning. Viktor did his job, followed orders, cleared buildings and dug foxholes, and fired at muzzle flashes, and tried not to think about Gary or his mother, or the fact that he'd probably die in some French village nobody back home could pronounce. The problem was ammunition, not the lack of it. The 29th had plenty of bullets. The problem was that in urban combat, in the stone buildings and narrow streets of French towns, bullets didn't always matter. A German soldier behind 2 feet of stone wall was effectively invincible to rifle fire. You could dump an entire clip into the masonry and accomplish nothing except giving away your position. The doctrine was to call in artillery or use satchel charges. But artillery took time, and satchel charges required you to get within throwing distance, which usually meant getting killed. Viktor watched it happen over and over. Squad pins down Germans in a building. Can't advance because of the machine gun. Can't retreat because that shows weakness and draws more fire. Calls for support. Waits. Germans either reinforce or escape while Americans bleed out in the street. Repeat until everyone's dead, or the objective doesn't matter anymore. On August 19th, Viktor's platoon got tasked with clearing a cluster of farm buildings outside St. Lo. Intelligence said it was a German observation post. Intelligence was wrong. It was a reinforced Wehrmacht squad with 2 MG-42 machine guns and enough ammunition to hold out for days. The Americans lost 4 men in the first 10 minutes trying to cross the courtyard. The machine guns were positioned behind stone window frames 18 inches thick. You could see the muzzle flashes. Couldn't hit the gunners. Couldn't suppress them. Couldn't do anything except die. Lieutenant Foster called for artillery. Got told the guns were supporting another action. Estimated wait? 4 hours. In 4 hours, the Germans might be gone. In 4 hours, more men would be dead. Victor lay behind a collapsed wall and watched tracers tear through the air 3 feet above his head and thought about Flynn and Brennan and Hartley and every other kid who died. Because the doctrine said, wait for support, when waiting meant bleeding. That night, back at the company position, Victor couldn't sleep. He sat in the corner of a half-destroyed barn and ran scenarios in his head. Every approach he could think of got someone killed. Direct assault, suicide, grenades, couldn't reach the windows. Flanking, the Germans had fields of fire covering every angle. The stone walls made rifle fire irrelevant, and without heavy weapons, they were stuck. Then he looked up at the barn's ceiling. What was left of it? Massive oak beams, some of them 12 feet long and straight as arrows. Hand-hewn timber that had held up that roof for 200 years before American artillery had brought it down. Victor stood up and walked over to one of the beams that had fallen across a pile of rubble. It was roughly 8 feet long, 4 inches in diameter at the base, tapered to 3 inches at the tip. He picked it up, felt the weight, the balance, ran his hand along the grain. It was almost exactly the same dimensions as the ash poles his grandfather had used. He thought about the German machine gunners behind those stone walls. Thought about how a rifle bullet couldn't reach them, but a 7-foot oak spear moving at 70 miles per hour could punch through a window and keep going. Thought about his grandfather killing wolves at 60 yards. Thought about the manual that said soldiers would be court-martialed for employing non-standard weapons in violation of regulations governing authorized armament. Thought about Flynn, dying in his arms. Victor pulled out his bayonet and started carving. It took him 3 hours to shape the beam into something resembling a javelin. He worked by moonlight in the corner of the barn, using his bayonet to strip away bark and splinters, smoothing the shaft, sharpening the tip to a point that could punch through timber. The oak was harder than the ash he'd trained with, which meant it was heavier, but also more durable. He tested the balance, made adjustments, took off another half-inch from the rear, to shift the center of mass forward. His hands cramped. He cut his thumb on a splinter and ignored the blood. The smell of fresh-cut wood filled the barn, mixing with the stink of cordite and diesel fuel. Nobody bothered him. Half the platoon was asleep. The other half was on watch or too exhausted to care what one Serbian kid was doing with a piece of timber. By 1:15 a.m., he had something that felt right. 7 feet 2 inches long, 4 pounds 6 ounces, tip sharpened to a wicked point. He stepped outside and found a gap in the rubble about 80 yards away, a section of collapsed wall that gave him a clear line of sight to a broken cart. He hefted the javelin, felt the weight settle into his palm, took 3 running steps, and released. The spear flew straight and true, buried itself 6 inches into the cart's wooden frame. Victor walked over and pulled it free. The tip was unmarked. The shaft hadn't cracked. He went back to the barn and made 4 more. The next morning, August 20th, Victor's squad got orders to probe the German positions east of the previous day's disaster. Nobody expected contact. It was a reconnaissance patrol, 12 men moving through the rubble to see if the Wehrmacht had pulled back during the night. Victor slung his rifle and carried 1 javelin in his right hand, the other 4 strapped across his back with parachute cord. Nobody asked about them. Soldiers carried all kinds of improvised equipment: trench knives, brass knuckles, enemy weapons. One more piece of oddball gear didn't merit attention. They moved through the ruins of what had been a prosperous farming village before the war. Stone houses reduced to skeletal walls, gardens churned into mud, a dead horse in the middle of the street, swollen to twice its normal size. The smell was overwhelming: decomposition and brick dust and sewage from broken pipes. At 11:23 a.m. they took fire from a 3-story building 200 yards ahead. Machine gun bursts, very precise, very controlled. Professional soldiers, not the teenage conscripts, the Wehrmacht was fielding more and more. The Americans scattered, found cover, returned fire. Same problem as always: couldn't see the shooter, couldn't suppress him, couldn't advance. Sergeant Valdez got on the radio, requested support. Got told they were too close to German lines for artillery. Mortars, maybe, 20 minutes out. Valdez acknowledged and clicked off. Looked at his squad. "We sit tight." Victor looked at the building. 3 stories, stone construction, windows blown out, but the walls intact. The machine gun was firing from the second floor, right side. He could see the barrel protruding from the window frame, maybe 75 yards, well within range. He unslung one of the javelins. "Dragomir, what the hell is that?" Valdez said. "Something I'm trying, Sarge." "You planning to throw a goddamn stick at a machine gun?" "Yes, Sergeant." Valdez stared at him. Victor met his eyes, didn't blink, didn't explain. Finally, Valdez shook his head. "You get yourself killed doing something stupid, I'm putting it in your obituary." Victor moved to the edge of their cover position, a collapsed section of wall that gave him a clear throwing lane. He could see the machine gunner now, just a shadow behind the muzzle flash, but the window opening was maybe 4 feet wide, plenty of room. He took 3 running steps, planted his left foot, rotated his hips, and released. The javelin flew in a flat arc, barely rising, covering 75 yards in just under 2 seconds. It went through the window opening, through the space where the machine gunner was crouched, and Victor heard the scream before the machine gun went silent. 5 seconds of absolute quiet. Then someone in the building started yelling in German. Another voice joined in. Panicked, high-pitched. Valdez was staring at Victor. "Did you just—" "Yeah." The Americans advanced, found the machine gunner pinned to the floor like an insect in a display case, the javelin through his chest and 6 inches into the floorboards. He was already dead. The other Germans had fled through the back of the building. Valdez pulled the javelin free, looked at the blood-stained oak, handed it back to Victor. "You're carrying those things from now on." Over the next 2 days, Victor killed 6 more Germans with his javelins. Each time, the pattern was the same. Wehrmacht soldiers in stone buildings, positions that couldn't be suppressed with rifle fire, distances between 60 and 90 yards. Each time, the javelin punched through window openings and found flesh. The Germans started abandoning positions as soon as they saw the Americans approaching, even when they had superior cover and firepower. Word spread through the battalion. The Serbian kid with the spears. Other soldiers started asking Victor to make them javelins. He showed them how to carve the shafts, how to balance the weight, but most of them couldn't throw worth a damn. The technique required years of practice, specific muscle memory, timing that couldn't be taught in an afternoon. Victor was polite about it, said they needed more training, but the reality was that bacanje koplja was a skill you learned as a child, or you didn't learn at all. On August 23rd, Victor's platoon got orders to clear a sector of Saint-Lô that intelligence said was lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong again. The Wehrmacht had reinforced overnight. 2 full squads, maybe 30 men, dug into the ruins of a commercial district. The Americans walked into a kill zone at 1:35 p.m. Victor's squad got separated from the platoon in the first 30 seconds. Machine gun fire from 3 directions, mortar rounds falling in the street, smoke and brick dust making it impossible to see more than 20 feet. They took cover in a cellar beneath what had been a butcher shop. 9 men pressed into a space built for storing meat. The Germans didn't assault immediately. They cordoned off the block and started a methodical advance, clearing each building, tightening the noose. Valdez did a weapons check. 19 rounds of rifle ammunition left, 3 grenades, Victor's 4 javelins. No radio, it had been destroyed by shrapnel. No way to call for help. No way out, except through the Germans. "We're going to have to break contact," Valdez said. "Wait until dark, try to slip through their line." Except, they could already hear German voices in the building above them. Boots on the floor. Commands being shouted. The Wehrmacht was thorough. They'd check every cellar, every room, every possible hiding place. Waiting for dark meant waiting to die. Victor looked at the cellar's entrance, a narrow stairway leading up to the ground floor. Anyone coming down those stairs would be silhouetted against the light, an easy target. But the Germans knew that too. They'd toss grenades first, then shoot anything that moved. Then he looked at the window wells, horizontal slits at ground level that let light into the cellar. 2 feet wide, 6 inches tall. Victor could see boots passing by outside. The Germans were setting up a perimeter. He took all 4 javelins and moved to the window well on the east side. Peered through. Saw 12 Wehrmacht soldiers in the street, taking cover behind rubble, rifles pointed at the buildings the Americans had disappeared into. The range was maybe 80 yards. The window well gave Victor a clear throwing lane, but limited his movement. He'd have to throw from a crouch, which reduced power and accuracy. He wedged himself into position, picked his first target, a German sergeant directing 2 soldiers toward a collapsed storefront. The sergeant was standing partially behind a stone wall, only his upper body visible. Victor would have to thread the javelin between 2 sections of rubble and hit a target the size of a dinner plate. He exhaled. Let his body remember what his grandfather had taught him. The Javelin was heavier than it should be for this angle, but he'd thrown in worse conditions. Gary Winters, trying to hit fence posts in 20-mile-per-hour winds. This was just another Sunday in the vacant lot. Viktor rose to a half crouch, took one step, rotated, released. The Javelin cleared the rubble by 3 inches, covered 80 yards in 2.1 seconds, took the sergeant through the upper chest. The German went down without making a sound. His soldiers stared at the Javelin protruding from their sergeant's torso, didn't understand what they were seeing, looked around for the shooter. Viktor was already loading his second Javelin, picked a machine gunner setting up a position behind an overturned cart. Harder shot, the gunner was crouched low, presenting a smaller target. Viktor aimed for center mass, threw with everything he had. The Javelin went high, caught the gunner in the throat instead of the chest. The result was the same. The German collapsed, arterial blood spraying across the cart. The Wehrmacht soldiers started yelling, fired blind into the buildings, trying to suppress an enemy they couldn't see. Viktor dropped below the window, repositioned, came up on the opposite side. 2 German soldiers were running toward the cellar entrance, probably planning to clear it. Viktor's third Javelin took the lead soldier through the back as he ran. Momentum carried the man forward 3 more steps before he realized he was dead. He collapsed in the doorway. The second soldier stopped running, stood absolutely still in the middle of the street, staring at his dead companion, trying to process what was happening. Viktor's fourth Javelin hit him in the chest with enough force to knock him backward 6 feet. That was it. 4 Javelins. 4 Germans dead in under 15 seconds. The Wehrmacht soldiers broke, just abandoned their positions and ran. No orders, no coordination, just pure panic. Viktor watched them disappear into the ruins to the east, heard someone screaming commands in German, heard the screaming fade as the distance increased. Valdez was beside him, at the window rifle ready, not believing what he was seeing. They're retreating. Yeah. You just killed 4 Krauts with sharpened sticks. Yeah. From a goddamn cellar window. Viktor didn't respond. He was already thinking about recovering the Javelins. You couldn't waste good oak. The platoon found them 20 minutes later. The rest of the sector was clear. The Germans had pulled back across the entire block, established a new defensive line 400 yards east. Lieutenant Foster couldn't explain it. The Wehrmacht didn't retreat from single squads of infantry. They certainly didn't abandon prepared positions because of small arms fire. Then Foster saw the 4 German bodies with javelins through them, and the explanation stopped mattering. Over the next week, Viktor killed 14 more Germans with his javelins. Every time he made a throw, word spread a little further. Other units started requesting Viktor's squad for building clearing operations. The Germans started calling him Der Speerteufel, the spear demon. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from late August mentioned American irregular employing archaic weapons and recommended immediate withdrawal from any position engaged by javelin-equipped forces. The German 342nd Infantry Division, which had held Saint-Lô against 3 American assaults, evacuated an entire sector on August 29th after Viktor's platoon killed 18 Wehrmacht soldiers in a single afternoon. None of those 18 were shot. All died from oak javelins thrown from ranges between 70 and 95 yards. German soldiers who'd fought in the building-to-building hell of Stalingrad said the spear demon was worse than Russian snipers. At least you could anticipate a bullet. At least you could hide behind stone and know you were safe. But a 7-foot javelin could punch through any window, any opening, any gap in the rubble, and by the time you heard it coming, you were already dead. Wehrmacht patrol reports from September started including specific instructions. Avoid engagement with Serbian-equipped American units. Withdraw to prepared positions and request artillery support. The German army, which had conquered most of Europe through aggressive combined arms tactics, was running away from one Serbian immigrant with sharpened sticks. American officers didn't know what to do with Viktor. The regulations were clear. Soldiers would not employ unauthorized weapons. But the results were impossible to argue with. In the 6 weeks between August 20th and October 1st, Viktor was credited with 32 confirmed kills, more than any other rifleman in the 29th Division. His squad's casualty rate dropped from 37% to 9%. Buildings that would have required artillery to clear were taken with 0 friendly losses. Finally, in early October, Colonel Jameson called Viktor to battalion headquarters. Viktor reported expecting a court-martial. Instead, Jameson handed him a new set of orders. Viktor was being transferred to a training battalion in Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where he would teach American soldiers how to make and throw javelins for urban combat. We can't officially authorize this, Jameson said, but we also can't ignore. that you've saved more American lives than anyone in this division. So we're calling it Specialized Close Quarters Combat Training and letting you teach whoever wants to learn. Victor taught at Camp Shelby for 4 months. Out of 237 students, exactly 8 could throw a javelin well enough to kill someone at 60 yards. The rest couldn't get the timing right, couldn't generate enough power, couldn't compensate for wind or angle or target movement. Victor was patient with them, showed them the techniques his grandfather had taught him, but in the end, he told the training cadre the truth. You can't learn this in a month. It takes years. I'm probably the only soldier in the American Army who can do this reliably. The Army quietly dropped the program in February 1945. No official documentation. No after-action reports analyzing the effectiveness of javelin tactics. Just a memo that said Specialized Close Quarters Combat Training was being discontinued due to limited applicability. Victor was reassigned to a rifle company and shipped back to Europe. He landed in France in March, carried his javelins through the final push into Germany, killed 11 more Wehrmacht soldiers before the war ended in May. Total confirmed kills, 43. Every single one with a sharpened oak pole. After the war, Victor went back to Gary, worked the docks again, hauling crates and welding scrap metal. Got married in 1948 to a Croatian girl named Anna who worked at the packing plant. Had 3 kids. Never talked about the war except to say he'd served in France and Germany. In 1963, a military historian named Patricia Brennan, Dennis Flynn's daughter, found references to Der Speerteufel in captured Wehrmacht documents and tracked Victor down through Army records. She asked if she could interview him for a book about unconventional tactics in World War II. Victor said no. She asked again the next year. He said no again. In 1967, she showed up at his house with copies of the German intelligence reports that mentioned him by name. He agreed to one interview, told her about the javelins, about St. Lo, about the 18 Germans, in one afternoon. She asked if he'd ever regretted using an ancient weapon in modern warfare. He said no. She asked if he was proud of what he'd accomplished. He said, "I did what I had to do to keep my squad alive, same as every other soldier." Patricia Brennan published her book in 1969, Irregular Warfare, Non-Standard Tactics in the European Theater. Victor got 2 pages. The book sold 1,400 copies and went out of print in 1971. Victor died in 1989. Heart attack, age 67, at the docks where he'd worked for 43 years. His obituary in the Gary Post-Tribune mentioned that he'd served in World War II with the 29th Infantry Division and received a Bronze Star. It didn't mention the javelins. It didn't mention Der Speerteufel. It didn't mention that he'd killed more enemy soldiers with a weapon from 500 BC than most riflemen killed with 20th-century firearms. Modern military historians estimate that Viktor Dragomir's javelin tactics saved between 60 and 90 American lives by reducing casualties in urban combat operations. His methods were never incorporated into official doctrine because they couldn't be. You can't train an entire army to throw like a Serbian shepherd. But in the specific context of 1944 France, where stone buildings made rifle fire ineffective and waiting for artillery meant watching men die, one immigrant, with a skill his grandfather taught him, changed how an entire German division fought. The Wehrmacht's August 1944 tactical reports show a clear pattern. German units that encountered Victor's javelins withdrew faster, held positions for shorter periods, and suffered disproportionate psychological casualties compared to units facing conventional American tactics. The spear wasn't more lethal than a bullet, but it was more terrifying. A German soldier could rationalize getting shot. That was war. That was the risk you accepted. But getting impaled by a sharpened stick, thrown from 80 yards away, by an enemy you couldn't see, that was something from the ancient world, something that violated every assumption about how modern warfare worked. And that terror had strategic value. Every Wehrmacht soldier who ran instead of fighting, every position abandoned early, every building left undefended because nobody wanted to face the spear demon. Those decisions gave American forces advantages that artillery and air support couldn't provide. Fear is a force multiplier, and Viktor Dragomir weaponized it with nothing but oak and skill, and the muscle memory his grandfather had beaten into him behind the rail yards in Gary, Indiana. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through engineering analysis, not through tactical committees, not through official doctrine. Through a Serbian immigrant who remembered what his grandfather taught him and decided that saving lives mattered more than following regulations. Through a private first class who looked at a barn beam and saw a weapon because he was willing to see past what the manual said was possible. The modern U.S. Army doesn't teach Javelin tactics, but it does teach initiative, adaptation, and the willingness to use unconventional solutions when conventional methods fail. Viktor Dragomir never knew he was teaching those lessons. He just knew that men were dying, and he had a way to stop it. And the fact that his method was 2,000 years old didn't make it wrong. Every soldier who breaks doctrine to save lives is following Viktor's example, whether they know his name or not. Every mechanic who modifies equipment against regulations, every squad leader who improvises tactics that aren't in the manual, every individual who decides that doing what works matters more than doing what's authorized. They're all descendants of the spear demon who terrified an entire German division with nothing but oak and accuracy and the refusal to watch his friends die when he could do something about it. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.